Chris Hynes, former Commissioner, Body Corporate and Community Management. With me, as always, every Thursday, Frank Higginson, partner, Hynes Legal. Frank, welcome.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone. Yet again for another little webinar.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. We really do appreciate the effort that people make to either watch live or watch after the event. Much appreciated, everybody. We reckon we've got a really interesting bit of content for you today. Just before we rip into that, as always, you can ask us a question live in the chat function. Please feel free to do so. We'll get through as many of that as we can. And don't forget to register for these events. That's how you find out what's coming up and when. Today, Frank, sequel time. We love our sequels on this webinar series, and today it's the sequel to the very popular first one we had not so long ago about the politics of Strata. And that one was well received, and we explored our theory that Strata and politics are very, very similar. And that first one, if you cast your memory back, everyone, was about counting the numbers. So assuming, Frank, you've counted the numbers correctly, and there are no guarantees about that, then the next logical step is lobbying and persuasion, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. It's communicating, almost importantly, making sure you've got the numbers with you locked in, and trying to persuade some of the numbers that might not be with you to switch camps. Because I think probably in these things where voting's not compulsory, swinging one or two people to vote your way, or I suppose in a sense to vote against what you don't want, can have massive ramifications in terms of the outcome of that particular vote. And even more so, I suppose, ordinary resolution's one thing, more votes for than against. When we're going towards a special resolution, and three limbs for that, but really the first one is that, you know, 2/3 of those who vote need to vote in favour. So 2 votes in favour, 1 against. If you suddenly pick up someone to vote against something on a special resolution that you wanted, that can actually have a major issue, because the opposition then need to go find someone else, 2 more people to vote for it. So It's a really interesting in terms of the exponential growth that these things can have for the different types of resolutions when it's not compulsory voting.
Absolutely. So to kick off the discussion today, we've plucked a real life scenario to sort of use as the, not so much as the basis, but just to add a bit of context. So those of you watching might recall just a couple of weeks ago now, or maybe even a bit longer, but really was not that long ago, there was a spill in the Commonwealth National Party, or the Federal National Party, where Barnaby Joyce got re-elected to the leadership and thus to the Deputy PM position. Heartbeat away from the top job, so that's no small election to hold. The Nationals have a pretty strict policy of never talking about the numbers in any of those meetings, but all media reports suggest it was as close as 11 to 10. That is literally as close as it can possibly be in an election. So what does all that mean? Well, it means that all it takes is one person to switch allegiances, and suddenly it changes in a heartbeat. It also means, doesn't it, Frank, Barnaby can vote for himself, can't he?
He can. I mean, we get dispelling misconceptions. That's absolutely one of the things we get. There's conflicts of interest at committee level in terms of voting on your own motions, not at general meeting. There's no conflict of interest at general meeting, because I suppose in effect everyone's got an interest in whatever goes on at general meeting, because decisions made there affect everyone. So if you've got to vote for yourself, make sure you always do it. But those numbers are really, really, I suppose, typical in a body corporate, isn't it? You might have 50 lots and 11/10 is going to decide something.
Absolutely.
All the time. So, and I suppose the other thing, as they always do before these elections, they're both, well, A, denying it's coming when everyone knew it was coming, and then when it arrived, everyone said they've got the numbers, and of course it's a bit like Thunderdome, isn't it? 2 men entered, only 1 man left.
Well, in this case, the incumbent, Michael McCormack, apparently was led to believe he was right, narrow as it was. And then apparently some of the people who said they would vote for him did not. So you'd have to think that one of 2 things transpired there. Either the numbers weren't counted properly, that's possible, or the second thing, McCormack and his people were not able to persuade people to stick with him.
Well, they got lied to.
Or number 3, they were lied to. Conversely, maybe it means that Chairman Barnaby Joyce was able to be just a teeny bit more persuasive. We don't know what he said. We don't know how he said it. That's something we're going to actually touch upon in this webinar to a little bit. But I suppose that the learning out of all of that, how close that vote was, every vote counts, doesn't it? To a non-aligned person or somebody who, not so much not aligned, but maybe not so, because when you talk about swinging voter, you're talking about 50-50, but maybe someone who's 60-40, but they just take a little bit of pushing and suddenly they go the other way, 50-50 or 40-60 again. And it's also about what you promise in exchange for getting support, isn't it, Frank?
It is. I mean, obviously in a body corporate context, you're not going to be able to offer cabinet positions as much as clearly that's what Barnaby probably did have on the table in that spot because the ministerial reshuffle afterwards was pretty swift. But yeah, it's a different level of politicking, which is really, again, that's what this stuff is. And whether it's at committee level in terms of getting your way, at general meeting level in terms of getting your way, that every vote counts is just so true. And we've seen them, and even mate, you talk about, dare I say it, with Sunday Waters, that decision. So there was a decision just before COVID arrived that threw the strata world into flux, where they now cured it. And there's an example here, so let me get to the end of it. They've cured it by changing the legislation to basically say that previously voting papers had to be delivered to the secretary. Now if they're delivered to the body corporate manager, they're okay. So there was a decision with Sunday Waters where 2 voting papers were delivered to a body corporate manager that on application to Chris's former office, they were disallowed because they didn't go direct to the secretary. And that meant that the special resolution failed. So at that stage, I think it might have been 41-20. And when those 2 votes were DQ'd, it became 39-20, which means you then don't have the 2/3 in favour. Those really fine lines make a huge difference, because we had a body corporate manager email us not 6 months ago saying, hang on a minute, based on this previous decision, shouldn't this be the case? And in that one, the special resolution passed by a mile. So knocking a couple of votes on the head didn't make any difference at all. But when you're in, I suppose, or involved in an issue that's really important to you, again, it just shows how close those things can be, because we have seen it before. And Chris, I need to get that quote from that district court decision, whichever one it is that we quote all the time in terms of litigation, where a district court judge looked at this legislation, BCCM legislation, and says, this is way too hard. No one's going to comply with everything all of the time. But if you're going to have a really technical fight, to be able to knock some votes on the head, also doesn't mean just because you lose the vote doesn't mean you're going to lose the adjudication afterwards if there's some technical deficiency. So it's just that scrapping for every single vote can make such a difference.
Absolutely, and that's the first takeaway from today. When we talk about persuasion and lobbying, you're persuading for every single vote, and nothing should be taken for granted in that process. Well, let's talk about persuasion and lobbying then, Frank, because I think that's largely what we're talking about today. There is no express prohibition on lobbying under body corporate legislation, none. I have lost count of the number of times when I was commissioner, and in this role too, where I have been asked that question at an event or a webinar, or a client has put it to me on the understanding that lobbying was not permitted, and then being absolutely shocked and outraged to find out it was not. But you can pretty much go for your life, and we'll get into the qualifications on that for a moment. The big qualifications on lobbying, Frank, come not for the individual, so not for the owners, but for the contractors to the body corporate, don't they? The body corporate manager and the caretaker.
Yep. So we see codes of conduct. Well, I see codes. There are codes of conduct under the BCCM Act, and what those codes prevent is a body corporate manager from unfairly, I think, Chris, what's the exact words? Unfairly influencing the election of a body corporate committee. I'll just tell unfairly influence the outcome of election for a body corporate committee.
Yep.
But there's no prohibition on management rights owners in that same context. So when we're looking at codes of conduct, body corporate managers and caretaking service contractors are put in the same code. So what do you take away from that? Well, A body corporate manager must not attempt to unfairly influence the outcome of a committee election, which of course means that A, they can fairly attempt to influence the outcome, and B, other than that, really, it's open to everyone to lobby in any way they choose. And I suppose there's, if you go to Part B of the Code of Conduct, not Part B, there's...
So we've put up a link for that now, there in the comments.
So have a look at that. And I suppose the other obligations, people can't engage in fraudulent or misleading conduct. They can't engage in unconscionable conduct. They must act fairly and professionally in performing their duties and all that sort of stuff. They're the sort of motherhood statements you'd say that exist in the code. And I don't think either of us, mate, are aware of a decision in the Commissioner's office or in fact any other court that talks about those interpretations. Because even if you look at that, again, it says there's a specific prohibition around body corporate managers and committees. Other than that, there's no prohibition at all about lobbying. So from a lot owner's perspective, free for all. And then when you add engaged contractors, they've got to act fairly and not unconscionably and so on. But if they do act fairly, that means they can still lobby in whatever frame they really want. So if I don't want, in a sense, again, factual matrix aside, if I don't want Chris to be on the committee, and I know that Chris has been convicted for trust account fraud in a prior life, and I circulate that newspaper clipping from his old hometown to all owners to say, do we really want to put this guy in charge of our body corporate? Is that unfair? Probably not. It's factual. Certainly not defamatory.
I wouldn't have thought so.
So yeah, so inevitably it's surprising. Like those codes of conduct have been there for a long time. Yet to see a blue about them in that context. But I suppose, again, absent there being some restriction, it really is, you can go for your life. Lobby in any way.
Particularly if you're an owner.
Yep.
Particularly if you're an owner. I suppose the qualifiers on that, Frank, are how hard you go. So when you start to use language threatening or abusive or, of course, defamatory, you're in a lot of trouble at that point. So if you go sending letters to all other owners saying Joe Bloggs in Unit 1 is a such and such, and they so-and-so can't use those words on this broadcast because they're forbidden, but you say, and he, raped and pillaged millions as well into the bargain, it's pretty likely that you're going to come unstuck with that sort of stuff. But we'll get to approaches on that point in a moment. There's been adjudicators' orders about lobbying in the past, and I think it's useful. So we're just going to put up a reference to one of the main ones. So the reference that just pops up in a minute, or will pop up, is about the decision in question. I won't read out everything that the adjudicator said, but blah, blah, blah. A lot owner lobbying for votes in the election of a person or persons to the committee positions and or voting for or against particular motions is not contrary to the legislation. It doesn't get much clearer than that. And to paraphrase what the adjudicator says elsewhere in that order, the adjudicator makes it clear that the processes around voting are such that it's very difficult for anybody to feel as though they are not given a full opportunity to participate. So if you're given notice of the meeting, notice of the motion, I suppose really, Frank, what it all comes down to is that the legislation presupposes that we're all adults here and we've got free will.
We do. We're not living in Stalinist Russia. We're entitled, and everyone's entitled to their point of view. And even the adjudication we did or spoke about with that one in North Queensland, where I think the adjudicator said everyone's entitled to their opinion, even if it's wrong.
Yep.
And that's the world in which we live, and that's the world in which body corporate lives. So, and we know that in effect, there's no such thing as privacy as it relates to owners' details to other owners. They're entitled to go and get those details, and they're entitled to put their point of view forward. And they're also entitled to, I suppose, have other people put their point of view forward. So it's sort of this, the silence is the interesting thing, is that people put in a motion, and then I suppose, mate, you and I, the reactions we get, the conversations we're having with clients about they can't do this, it's like, well, you put in a motion, people are entitled to put their point of view forward to other owners. It's not just decided on the floor of the meeting on the day, because the reality is that usually, and even more so now, I mean, we've had our masks extended for another week today, 2 weeks, Sydney's in lockdown. We're living in the technology era where people, A, can attend electronically, but are still not obliged to. So a lot of these things are decided before the actual day of the meeting.
And so I think that brings us to a big learning out of all of that discussion. So you can talk about the ethics or whatnot of lobbying, but as we've established, it's pretty well open slather with some qualifiers. But remember, the one big point about lobbying, regardless of anything else, you can go your hardest on lobbying for something within your body corporate, but remember, so too can somebody else for the opposite position as well. So if you're out there fighting hard to see your motion get up, it's yin yang. Somebody else could be out there fighting equally as hard to make sure it doesn't. So you've got to always keep that in the back of your mind. That also means that not only do you have to promote the outcome that you want, you have to be prepared to rebut the contrary argument as well. That, I think, Frank, is where a lot of people would come unstuck in a body corporate. I think they do well at one, but then forget about the other.
Absolutely, because that is true yin yang, isn't it? It's sort of that, playing the man and not the ball to a degree conversation, because and these things are really interesting to do legally. And I suppose part of it is this is one of the things Chris helps clients with, and I've done a bit of it over the years as well, is making sure you stay on point and on message with whatever it is you're trying to actually achieve, because there's no formula for these things. It's very reactive, because if you fire something out, you're then waiting to see what your opponents might fire back, and then you've got to react to that in the right way, or do you react at all? So it's a really interesting process. And I think, mate, the other thing, and I'm sure this is going to blow some people out of the water who are watching this, is that we hear a lot about pork barrelling in politics. We see sports rorts. Bridget McKenzie, I suppose, is one of the new cabinet members who disappeared from cabinet after all of that before the last election. In a body corporate context, you can actually pay people to vote for you. You can incentivize them. You can reward them financially. So you don't need to worry about, in a sense, promising to put up a pool or a new sports centre in that particular electorate. You can say, Chris, if you vote for me, I will give you $100. And there is nothing in the legislation that stops that happening. Now, legally,
that's a big.
You've got to, how you nail it down and control that process and make sure people do what they do is a completely separate story. But you can do that. You
can. Yep. That's probably a discussion for another time in a bit more detail, but we just thought we'd leave that with everybody today. We can't see where the prohibition on that is at this point under body corporate legislation. Putting that aside for one moment, though, how do you go about persuading? Well, look, you could talk to 100 people and they'd probably give you 100 different methods for how to persuade somebody to do something. But we think ultimately it boils down to two very broad categories. There's a positive way and there's a negative way. Or another way of putting that, do you catch flies with honey or do you catch flies with vinegar? I think you and I, Frank, were agreed catching flies with honey is probably in 80 to 90% of cases the way to go.
Yep, absolutely. And that's back to sort of playing the man and not the ball to a degree sometimes as well. And I mean, this is Politics 101. You look at every single election campaign, federally, state or otherwise, and a lot of those messages are negative ones. You know what I mean? It's sort of, we come back to the last federal election here where Clive Palmer spent, squillions of dollars. What was it? The bill Australia can't afford. Bill Short. I mean, that is obviously very personal, negative, directed attack. As much as it didn't produce an outcome for him personally, I suppose it might have produced a negative outcome for Bill. But in a body corporate context, we both think that's not necessarily what wins votes. Again, subject to what it is that you're actually talking about. It might be if Chris is going for, well, let's go treasurer, and he has had a criminal conviction for trust account fraud, and I'm the person that's going for it, and I'm a fine, upstanding lawyer that's never had any difficulties in my life, then I might go on the offensive and say, this bloke's been done for taking millions from this. Do you want him in charge? And that might be purely my line, as opposed to if it's the both of us going for it, and I think I'm a better manager of people, and maybe it's because I've been running a law firm for 30 years, and that's my pitch. I'm better because, as opposed to this guy's bad because.
Yeah, so that's right, Frank. You sort of take it based upon what you presented with. I think why we're fans in the positive method, rather than focusing on the shortcomings of the other party and their argument, you actually focus on all of the benefits and all of the positives of what you want. And that's whether you want something passed or want something not passed. You focus on the positive outcomes or the constructive outcomes out of what you want. So in effect, you're talking it up. If it's a motion, you're talking up the benefits of the motion. If it's a person, you're talking up the skills and the expertise of the person, rather than spending all your time trashing your competitor. We think that works better because it enables you to mount a case for financial and other benefits. And we think that hip pocket approach is ultimately the one which works in most situations. Again, as Frank quite rightly pointed out, there will be some scenarios in which you might actually have to go a lot harder and a bit more negative with your approach. But I think we're agreed, Frank, that's the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably for me, more than anything else, it's sort of in a body corporate context, it's people's investments. And you know, most of the motivated voters are always going to be the owner occupiers. So I think if you're staying positive about your particular community where people are living, I think that probably for me sells better than canning things. You know what I mean? It just I think identifies better with the people you're trying to convince to come onto your side as to why this is good for everyone, which is what everyone's really looking for. But it depends.
I guess, yeah, no, that's right. And so whether it's positive or negative approaches, the next step is the how you do it. And the most common way in which that happens is a mail out to all owners, or rather everyone who is eligible to vote. So you start that process, of course, by having an up-to-date copy of the roll. You try and email that out, or you do a hard copy if that was necessary. You might put letters in mailboxes. Under doormats or under doors if you're in the building. I reckon you've got to be real careful about that last one though. I reckon slipping a note under someone's door or in their door frame or under the mat, that has the potential to come across as a bit confronting. So I just reckon you need to be a bit careful with that one. It might be that that's unavoidable, particularly if it's a really small building and everybody knows each other. I personally I'm not a huge fan of that one, Frank.
No, and the other thing is actually find out who the voters are, because not everyone who lives on site might be a voter.
That's right.
There could be tenants, occupiers, other, you know.
You've got to do your homework.
You do.
You've got to know.
And I'll give you a little sidebar that I don't think I've ever told you before, Chris. So at one stage we had a guy working with us who was an Excel machine, unbelievable, and we had a really good client at that stage who wanted to go into government, stand for election, and he went and got the electoral roll. And what we had done, well, what this guy did was convert it so that he knew, because obviously, again, in houses as well as units, people aren't, if they're not on the roll, there's no point talking to them. So rather than door knock all of the houses in one side of the street to the other, we then organised it to odds and evens on the streets in an order, so he could literally walk round corners, map out, I need to talk to the 1, 5, 7, 9, 21, 26, and those were the only doors he knocked on. So body corp.
Did he
did.
Did he win?
He did. Yeah.
There you go.
So it took him about sort of 6 months worth of preparatory work, but I suppose that's hard work got him there. Wore a couple of pairs of shoes.
And I guess I'm conscious of time. I guess the big question there is what you actually say in that communication. And look, I mean, that is another webinar in and of itself, I reckon. And it's actually work that we've been doing. I've been doing a bit of lately with a few clients. There are many different ways. If you think you're a good enough wordsmith, go for your life. But you want to just make sure you craft the right narrative and the right communique about that. But we might have to, as I say, that might be the subject of another webinar. You've also got to be prepared to be to have it negatively to be attacked as a response. So you might send out your letter, and then someone comes back to you and says, "How dare you? Why? How? What makes you think that you can do this?" You've got to be prepared for that. You've got to be prepared to be able to respond. And again, responding positively as opposed to, well, I did it because I can. I'm not sure that that's going to cut the mustard. But I reckon, Frank, and we've got a couple of comments there that we'll get to before the end, but I reckon, Frank, in the short time we've got left, that brings us back to the point that we mentioned earlier. You don't embark on this process of persuasion unless you know what you're dealing with, do you?
No, you got to map. You got to have a plan. You know, the old Lewis Carroll, isn't it? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So it's, what are we trying to achieve? What's our community like? How do the individual members of that community like being communicated with? Are we going to door knock? Are we going to do tea and coffee? Are we going to drop round for a beer? Are we going to do a phone call? We're just going to do an email and leave them alone. You know, it's.
Do they need to be wooed, Frank? Some people need to be wined and dined before they'll agree to anything. Are there people like that in your body corporate? Sometimes people will want a third party involved, someone to broker a discussion. They don't want to do it directly. They want somebody else in there. Do they need just a short conversation, or is it a very long, drawn out process? I don't know the answer to that. You don't know the answer to that, Frank. Only you will know the answer to that after you've done your research and done the work to know what your building is like. And you might not be able to know that about everyone, but you make the effort to find it out as much as you reasonably can. Frankly, it's not as simple as just door knocking and saying, vote for me. There's much more to it than that, isn't there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But you can, you know, even I suppose the best one I've seen was a big A3 printed thing that folded over, which was for a committee campaign. Here's your big glossy, all that sort of stuff, building name on the front with a picture, and inside were the 7 committee member candidates, and the back page was, this is why we as a group want to be the committee. I can't actually tell you what happened with the outcome because we were on the sidelines watching it with interest, but it was, yeah, very professionally done. Would have cost hundreds of dollars at least, probably more. That's what they were doing.
Just a couple of comments there. Gleno, any thoughts on body corporate acting reasonably in the best interest of the owners in making decisions at committee and general meeting? Well, that's legislated that they have to act reasonably, and that's always the subject of dispute. Potentially, always. So just about impossible to offer much of a comment on that because it will be different in every single case, every single time. Julia, thanks as always for tuning in. Where is the line for defamation? Well, it's
a bloody good question. And they're introducing new sort of national defamation laws now. I think we've just had them start in Queensland, which is really. And to be completely honest, I haven't sat down and read them all in detail yet, but it's really raising the bar in terms of there being significant harm to someone's reputation before you can commence defamation proceedings. So potentially there's going to be more stones thrown if the risk of getting sued is less afterwards. But ultimately, almost in a sense, anything can be defamatory, but the ultimate defence to anything defamatory is truth. So if I say Chris has been convicted of trust account fraud, and he has been, I keep saying that, mate, like it is, and I'm not, before you get offended, it's true, then it's not defamatory. Whereas if it wasn't true, then it absolutely would be defamatory because that'd be a massive blow to his reputation. So it's those things. And the difficulty with defamation sometimes is it can be a little bit subjective too, in terms of what you don't necessarily know what might hurt someone's reputation because you don't know what else they've got going on in their lives from a business perspective or a personal perspective. So that's why, those things can be pretty brutal.
Definitely. And another query from Gleno. Thanks for that. Any thoughts on alliances that always vote as a block, no matter what? So I hear about block voting quite a bit. nothing wrong with block voting. If you think about it, again, those of us who are old enough would probably have come from households in which it's usually dad who said, we're voting this way in this house, and that's how it will be always. It's the same sort of thing here. I mean, you hear about lifelong Labor voters, lifelong Conservative voters. It's the same sort of thing here. I'm always going to vote this way because that's the way I've always done it, or person A is doing a good job, or whatever. Glenno, the challenge is breaking the block, basically. So if there are a block of people who vote the same way all the time, and that is an impediment to getting something done that you want done, then you have to break the chain. How do you break the chain? Yeah.
Or you get it, you've got enough, there's 5 votes against you every single time, so you've got to go and marshal 6, one of which is you.
Absolutely. All it takes is getting 1 or 2 of those to possibly swing the other way, and suddenly that block is reduced. You've got to think about the fact that they are a group, they think the same way. It might be a case of picking out which one is most susceptible to persuasion and focusing from that point. Oh, well, we've come to the end. There's a lot there, isn't there? And so stay tuned for another part of this one, because there's a lot more to go on persuasion, lobbying, counting the numbers, and so on. Preview for next week, though. Next week, we've got a very cool topic. Air conditioner installation. Issues, dramas, pros, cons. Middle of winter, but we all know what that means. It's the prime time to either be thinking about installing or doing something with your aircon. Now's the time to do it. So next week, we're going to talk about that. What are some of the issues that you need to be aware of?
Statutory easements too?
Why the hell not?
Oh, how very exciting.
Let's do that. But for now, thanks everybody for tuning in. Frank, thank you.
Thanks, mate. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks. We'll see everybody next week. Bye-bye.